Greetings and thank you for tuning into this video. This is the 6th section for the sequence of events for the tribulation. We're still in the first half of the tribulation. We're going to pick up where we left off. We are now going to be beginning with the battle for Jerusalem, and this is point number 29 for the first part of the tribulation. And point 29 is, the devil begins to wage war against Israel before the middle of the 7 years. Revelation 12:13 says, "And when the dragon saw that he was thrown down to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child." The next event, number 30. The beast receives full authority from the devil 44 days before the exact middle of the 7 years. Now that's day 1216. Now I've gone ahead and left up day number 1186 here from the previous video. Now day 1186 is the last day. That's the day that the Pope terminates the sacrifice under the encouragement of the beast, who is still rising in power. But, excuse me, here, this is the day that the beast receives full demonic authority from the devil who has been cast down. Now, given that he still has his authority, when he places the abomination of desolation in the temple 44 days before the end of the 7 years, and that his authority is removed that day at the 7th trumpet, then his 42 months must begin 44 days before the exact middle of the 7 years. And that, again, that's going to be day number 1216. Now let's look at the duration. The duration of his authority is given several different ways. It's given as times, time and a half time, or as 42 months. And we can see this in several passages in Daniel. That would be Daniel chapter 7, 21 through 22, Daniel 12, 7, Revelation 13, 1 through 10. Especially Revelation 13, verse 7. The beast has a mission. And that mission is war against Israel. And we get this from Daniel chapter 7, verses 21 through 22. And I kept looking that the horn was waging war with the saints and overpowering them. Now let's look at some implications. Specifically, when Jesus descends and casts the beast into a lake of fire, he is a beast that is already stripped of his authority. Now the beast has 42 months of authority, which is half of 7 years. But because he gets his authority 44 days before the middle, his authority ends 44 days before the end of the tribulation. So when Jesus returns and actually descends, the beast has already been stripped of all of his authority. And because his authority begins 44 days before the exact middle, there is an overlap of the beast's authority and the ministry of God's two witnesses of about 44 days. It's exactly 44 days. Now let's look at the two Babylons. First, Mystery Babylon, that is Papal Rome, is destroyed by the beast and his lieutenants. And there are two Babylons that are discussed in Scripture, Rome, Italy, and Babylon in Iraq. And we're going to look at both of those right now. Now, Revelation 17 describes the destruction of Mystery Babylon, that is Papal Rome. But Revelation 18, as well as Jeremiah 50 and 51, and Isaiah 47, and other places, describe the destruction of Babylon the Great, that is Babylon in modern Iraq. There are there are several reasons to believe that there are two locations being discussed. First, there are two types of destruction and two origins of destruction. Mystery Babylon is destroyed by the beast and his lieutenants, and this is a human destruction by human means. There is no indication that God follows up with additional judgment. On the other hand, Babylon the Great is conquered by the armies of the north and the Medes, that is Russia and Iran. And immediately after that, God destroys Babylon the Great with a great earthquake. This is the seventh vial judgment. And with 100-pound stones. And Jeremiah 50, verse 46, describes this destruction and conquering as occurring on the same day. The response to the destruction is different. This is another reason why we're talking about two different cities. The beast and his lieutenants destroy Mystery Babylon because they hate her. Revelation 17, verses 16 and 17. In fact, it says in verse 16, "And the 10 horns which you saw, and the beast, these will hate the harlot, and will make her desolate and naked, and will eat her flesh, and will burn her up with fire." On the other hand, at the destruction of Babylon the Great, the response to the destruction of Babylon the Great will be an outcry of great mourning. Again, we find this from Jeremiah 50, verse 46, as well as several repetitions in Revelation chapter 18. A third reason we understand that we're looking at two different cities, and that is the description of their guilt is different. The guilt of Mystery Babylon, papal Rome, can be summed up as immorality with the world and its leaders and murder of Jews and believers. And this is Revelation 17, verses 2 and verse 7. Now there is another reason to believe that Mystery Babylon is the papacy and the Catholic Church. They violated James 1:27. Even worse, the two verses in Revelation 17 suggest that it was the church that polluted the world. And James 1:27 tells us that pure and undefiled religion in the sight of our God and Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their distress. And now here's the key: and to keep oneself unstained from the world. And yet Revelation 17 tells us that it was the world that was defiled because of the church. Now, the guilt of Babylon the Great begins with the destruction under Nebuchadnezzar. And all of the evil, the guilt of Babylon the Great begins in Jeremiah with the destruction of God's temple and all evil done in Israel under Nebuchadnezzar's rule, along with the murder of God's messengers, God's believers, everyone murdered on the earth. Now, this last charge, everyone murdered on the earth, extends all the way back to Genesis chapter 4. So this is a huge difference in the guilt, and this is a huge guilt that's being given vengeance by God on Babylon the Great. And I'm going to read a few of these. Jeremiah 51:11. Vengeance of the Lord, vengeance for his temple. Jeremiah 51, verse 24. But I will repay Babylon and all the inhabitants of Chaldea for all their evil that they have done in Zion. Again, we're focusing on Israel. But in 51:49, indeed Babylon is to fall for the slain in Israel, as also for Babylon the slain of all the earth have fallen. And this is repeated in Revelation 18:24, all who have been slain on the earth. So the guilt of Babylon the Great is much greater than the guilt for papal Rome, that is Mystery Babylon. And now we look at the timing of the destruction is different. Mystery Babylon is destroyed during the last 44 days of the first half of the tribulation. And it probably occurs very quickly after day 12:16, when the beast gets his full demonic or full satanic authority. Because he's going to want to get rid of them immediately. Now, Babylon the Great is destroyed during the last 44 days of the tribulation at the seventh vial judgment. This is 3.5 years later. So here you have the destruction of Mystery Babylon by the beast, and down here you have the destruction of Babylon the Great by the Persians and the Russians, as well as by the seventh vial judgment. Now we look at Babylon the Great is destroyed during the last 44 days. I provided you with a chart to show that to you. Now, the origin of Rome's destruction. God is in control. The beast is the one actually doing the destruction with his lieutenants, and he hates papal Rome. But we need to remember God is in control, for God has put it in their hearts to execute his purpose by having a common purpose and by giving their kingdom to the beast until the words of God should be fulfilled. In other words, not only does the beast now have full satanic authority, he has taken the authority that belonged to the Pope and it is now his. He then turns around and destroys papal Rome and wipes out all vestiges of what previous authority existed. Again, the timing for Rome's destruction. It is likely that the beast will attack Rome as soon as he receives that full satanic authority. The prince who makes the 7-year covenant is the same person who terminates the sacrifice in the middle, and that was at day 1186. Therefore, the prince is still in power 74 days before the middle. In order for the beast to succeed in destroying the harlot, he must have the authority to do so. And of course, the beast receives that full satanic authority 44 days before the middle. Now, Clarence Larkin, back in 1919, 100 years ago, notes that papal Rome will be destroyed as soon as the beast receives his authority. And he wrote in his commentary, this, that is the destruction of Mystery Babylon, will occur at the time that the worship of the beast is set up, for Antichrist in his jealous hate will not permit any worship that does not center on himself. And the third item under the timing for Rome's destruction, these two world leaders, that is, the Pope and the beast, they cannot have the same authority at the same time. The harlot's level of authority before Rome is destroyed is stated in Revelation 17:15, which states, "The waters which you saw, where the harlot sits, are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues." And Revelation 17:18 confirms that the harlot has a kingdom over, basically it says that the woman has a kingdom over the kings of the earth. Revelation 13:7 gives that same level of authority to the beast for 42 months, which means the Pope's authority ends and all of that authority is then given to the beast. And we'll run into this again at the seventh trumpet when Jesus takes over that same level of authority. Now the beast's authority begins 44 days before the exact middle. Here we go. Warfare during the second half focuses upon Israel and believers worldwide. Satan and the beast, they're not interested in Rome anymore, and there's nothing else in Scripture that refers to that. Letter D, we're still under Mystery Babylon. Papal Rome is destroyed. The two Babylons, they are not religious and economic. Now, I realize that a lot of you have been taught this, but as you'll see very quickly, this particular split, religious and economic, it doesn't hold up to scrutiny at all. The two cities, Rome and Babylon, are the correct identities, but religious and economic, they're the wrong labels. First, there is no mention of religion or worship with regard to the harlot. Religion is assumed because the description of her attire matches papal garment. Now, this is not to say that there is no religious component, only that it is not plainly stated. Also, after the rapture, all that's left of the Catholic Church is just an empty shell of paganism. Religious rites, formality, but there's nothing truly there. Two things are plainly stated. First, the harlot has a global authority. Again, Revelation 15, the waters which you saw where the harlot sits are the peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. And that the capital city of the harlot is Rome. And the woman which you saw is the great city, which reigns, which is currently having a kingdom over the kings of the earth. So when John wrote this, in AD 90, between AD 90 and 95, the world capital was Rome. So that's what it's referring to. With Babylon the Great, the references to trade in Revelation 18 are used to justify the idea that it's economic. but this is assumed at the expense of the obvious. With the beast, who rules and reigns for 42 months, worship is plainly stated, and this is religion. Now, the whole world will worship the dragon and the beast. This is in Revelation 13, 1 through 10. Excuse me. It is clear that the whole world will worship the dragon and the beast, and that the duty of the false prophet is to deceive the whole world into worshiping the beast. Revelation 13:4, as well as Revelation 13:12. Letter B. Daniel 11:36-38. The willful king rejects all other religions that he be worshipped. Again, this is religion. The 32nd event. There is praise in heaven over Rome's destruction. Now this is recorded in Revelation 19 verses 1 through 3. And while this is recorded in Revelation 19, 1 through 3, the actual event likely occurs immediately after Rome's destruction, just before the middle of the tribulation. That this is a reference to Rome and not Babylon the Great of Revelation 18 is clear, because the title harlot is used, as well as the mention of her guilt, which is immorality with the world and the killing of Jesus' servants. Event number 33. A group of Israelites flee for protection. This is in Isaiah 26, as well as in Revelation 12:6 and verse 14 as well. This is the first, we call this the first group or a first flight, a first fleeing if you want to. Many Israelites flee and spend 1,260 days during the second half of the 7 years in a protected place. Now, let's look at the timing of the protection, and we're going to work our way down we're going to look from the end of that protection to adjust to see where they would have actually departed. The protection is not needed after Armageddon. Now, this is a very key point here. Their protection is 1,260 days. And it probably ends immediately after the Battle of Armageddon, because with the armies of the world destroyed, and the devil in the abyss, and the beast and the false prophet in the lake of fire, they don't need to be protected anymore. So the earlier they come out of protection, the earlier they go into protection before the midpoint of the tribulation. Upwards of maybe a week or so. Now, why would they do this? They may participate in the post-Armageddon conquering. Now, if this group of people come out of protection immediately after Armageddon, they are able to participate in the Israelite conquering of the surrounding nations that occurs just before the millennium. And this is in several places in Isaiah, especially Isaiah 11, right around verse 14. And we'll get to that when in the appropriate sequence when we get there. And then you'll understand what I'm getting to. Letter C. They enter protection before the middle of the tribulation. Now, again, if they come out of protection immediately after Armageddon, then they must have entered protection several days before the middle of the tribulation, perhaps upwards of a week earlier. Let's look at it based upon the earthquake of Revelation 12:6 and Revelation 11:13. Now, there is a great earthquake that ends the sixth trumpet. And it actually says, the earth helped the woman. Now, this would have the fleeing Israelites in transit or at their final location between the death and the resurrection of the witnesses, and the quake then sealing in their protection. Now, this would be similar to the Red Sea at the time of the Exodus. The Israelites crossed the Red Sea closed. They couldn't go back, but Pharaoh's army couldn't attack them anymore either. In a similar fashion, as this group of individuals flees to go into protection, the devil goes after them, but the earth opens up and helps them. Now, the location of their protection. It is commonly taught that Petra will be the location of their protection, but there are two really good reasons for rejecting this. First, Petra's in the heart of Edom. And Edom is in the heart of special judgment and destruction during the tribulation. Now, the more one reads the prophecies of destruction against Edom in the Old Testament, the more it becomes difficult to accept that Jesus would place his people at the very heart of his destruction. Now, Edom is the southern portion of what is modern Jordan. Petra was made by man, but the place of protection where these people are going is prepared by God. Now, the only things that we can say for certain is that her place, that is the Israelites who are fleeing for protection, that it's in the wilderness, and that their location is prepared by God. Now, it is likely that God's provision will be as miraculous for them as it was for Elijah in 1 Kings 17. And that brings us to the midpoint of the tribulation. And we're going to now transition into the second half. This is the great persecution. It's most of the second half. It's all but the last 44 days. And we're going to look at the passages related to the second half. And we refer back to Matthew, if you remember from the very first video, how we divided Matthew chapter 24 in the Sermon on the Mount. Verses 9 through 14 of Matthew 24 are describing this portion of the tribulation. Then they will deliver you to tribulation and will kill you, and you will be hated by all nations on account of my name. And at that time many will fall away and will deliver up one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise and will mislead many, and because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow cold. Here it is. But the one who endures to the end, he shall be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world for a witness to all nations, and then the end shall come. Daniel chapter 7, verses 8 through 28. The little horn is the beast. This discusses the beast actions during the great persecution, the latter half of the 7 years. And again, Daniel 11, verses 36 through 39. The willful king in this passage, and down through the remainder, in fact, down through the remainder of Daniel 11, is the beast. Now let's begin the sequence of events. Now these first two items, this is the death of the two witnesses, as well as the official termination of all temple worship. It's exactly at the middle, so it could either be in the first half or the second half. I chose for presentation purposes to put it in the second half. But let's look here. The persecution begins halfway through the 7 years. And this is Matthew 24, verse 9. Then they will deliver you to tribulation and will kill you, and you will be hated by all nations on account of my name. The beast murders the two witnesses halfway through the 7 years. Revelation 11, verse 7. The murder of the two witnesses may be the formal outward beginning of the persecution. And the killing of the two witnesses and the termination of the temple sacrifice, temple service, everything that goes on there, will probably occur on the same day and in that order, and very quickly, one right after the other. Once the two witnesses are dead, there's nothing to stop the beast from clearing the temple. Now, all temple services are terminated at the middle of the 7 years, and this is at 42 months. Number 4, everyone will see the bodies of the witnesses, and unbelievers will rejoice. This verse describes two groups of people. And let me read this verse to you. And their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city, which mystically is called Sodom and Egypt, where also their Lord was crucified, so we know it's Jerusalem. Those from the peoples and tribes and tongues and nations, that is everybody, will look at their dead bodies for 3.5 days and will not permit their dead bodies to be laid in a tomb. Second group. And those who dwell on the earth will rejoice over them and celebrate, and they will send gifts to one another, because these two prophets tormented those who dwell on the earth. God's witnesses are resurrected and ascended. Revelation 11, verses 11 and 12. And after 3.5 days, the breath of life from God came into them, And they stood on their feet, and great fear fell upon those who were beholding them, and they heard a loud voice from heaven saying to them, "Come up here." And they went up into heaven in the cloud, and their enemies beheld them. The next event, very quickly. The earthquake that follows the resurrection of the two witnesses finishes the sixth trumpet, that is, the second woe. And for grouping purposes, I have included Revelation 9:13 all the way through 11:14, although Revelation chapter 10 is kind of an intercalation there. It's a break in the text. The earthquake survivors give glory to God. Now this may be a new group of people coming to faith. The resurrection of the witnesses and the earthquake that follows causes some to give glory to God. And this is in Jerusalem at least. But given that the whole world looks upon the dead bodies of the witnesses, we can ask, are those who give glory to God Israelites alone, or are there some Gentiles who come to faith because of this? Now this is another great sign to unbelievers. Imagine as an unbeliever standing there, resurrection, ascension, and earthquake all happening very quickly. It is a wonderful and terrible sign at the same time. And in that hour there was a great earthquake, Revelation 11:13. And a tenth of the city fell, and 7,000 people were killed, and the rest were terrified and gave glory to the God of heaven. Now this is a special chronological note because I want to make sure you understand. From the death of the witnesses up to this point, everything has occurred within 4 days. Number 9. The devil begins to wage war against all believers. This is Revelation 12:17. Number 10. The false prophet begins his ministry. This is Revelation 13 verses 11 through 18. And we're going to look at his timing after God's true witnesses are gone. Now there is no mention specifically of when the false prophet starts his ministry or the duration of his ministry, but we do know, Revelation 19 verses 19 and 20, he is with the Antichrist when they're thrown into the lake of fire. But given that the false prophet must be an Israelite, this timing seems most likely for the beginning of his ministry because God's true witnesses are gone, and he could certainly not have passed himself off as the true Elijah when the real Elijah is still alive and standing in the temple. His mission. His mission is to convince the world to worship the beast. Revelation 13:12 in the second half. And he makes the earth and those who dwell in it to worship the first beast whose fatal wound was healed. How does he do this? What is his method of deception? He has deception through celestial miracles. In other words, fire from heaven. And he performs great signs so that he even makes fire come down from heaven to the earth in the presence of men. And this is a reenactment of one of Elijah's most famous miracles from 1 Kings 18 verses 16 through 40. Now the false prophet is able to perform the same miracle as Elijah, and it's perhaps to prove that he's the real Elijah and that the first one wasn't true, even though the other one was the true Elijah. Number 2, deception through a talking statue. This is the abomination of desolation. The abomination of desolation is not a person. It is a talking statue. Okay? Revelation 13:15. That the image of the beast might even speak and cause as many as do not worship the image of the beast to be killed. Now there's no indication of how quickly the statue was created. Presumably it will be located at the throne of the beast before it is moved to the temple in Jerusalem, and that's Revelation 16:10. The statue is not a talking robot, and the false prophet is not an engineer. To suggest the first is to suggest that humans of that time are so ignorant they cannot tell the difference between a computerized robot and a genuine miracle. Now, in this same passage, don't miss this, Because in the exact same passage, the false prophet makes fire come down from heaven, and he gives breath to the image. This talking statue will be a genuine demonic miracle. And the discussion of this statue, this talking statue, is within the greater context of satanic deception. Excuse me. Finally, the phrase, give breath to the image, is similar to Genesis chapter 2, verse 7, where God breathed into Adam the breath of life. The abomination of desolation is going to be a living or semi-living creature, a genuine satanic miracle. His method is the mark. At the beginning of the 7 years, God initiates a branding process, whereby anyone who gets saved receives an invisible or divine seal on his forehead. Now, at the halfway point, the devil initiates his own imitation branding process, where his followers receive a visible mark, which is either on their forehead or on their right hand. And the mark of the beast is as much about commerce and control as it is about a sign of ownership by the devil and worship of the beast. And we get this from Revelation 13, verses 16 through 18, where it says, and no one should be able to buy or sell except one who has the mark. So it's all about commerce and survival. Number 11, we're in the second half of the tribulation. Number 11, the 144,000 sealed Israelites from the sixth seal at the very beginning of the tribulation are in heaven with Jesus. Revelation 14, verses 1 through 5. And I have them just after the middle of the tribulation. Now, assuming that the events of Revelation 14 are in sequential order in there, at least in sequential order, then the 144,000 are in heaven before the final proclamation of the gospel, of the eternal gospel, which is mentioned in the next two verses, Revelation 14, 6 and 7. Now, this is also referred to as the gospel of the kingdom by Jesus in Matthew 24, 14. Now, I suggest that they are raptured right around the midpoint of the 7 years, perhaps right after the murder of the two witnesses. Their continued presence as witnesses is no longer necessary, as some of the survivors of the earthquake in Jerusalem at the end of the sixth trumpet, they get saved. So there is a continued human witness for the purpose of continued evangelism. And also, their continued presence on the earth would make them targets for martyrdom by the beast and the devil, and this would be contrary to their position as firstfruits. Firstfruits are never offered on the altar, and calling them firstfruits suggests that they are never martyred. Now we have another special chronological note. Over 3 years is going to pass between what we just saw, the 144,000 in heaven, and the very next event. We're going to go from here all the way down to here. And I wanted to make sure you understand that the vast majority of here, God's witnesses are gone. There are no more judgments by the two witnesses. But you can't, if you wish to think it so, God has turned loose the devil and the beast and the false prophet on the earth. And that is a form of punishment. Because these three are now running rampant, killing everything on the earth. They are destroying everything they get their hands on. Now, number 13. The eternal gospel is preached to the whole world one more time, just before the placement of the abomination of desolation in the temple. Matthew 24, 14, Revelation 14, verses 6 through 7. God gives mankind one more chance, just before the end. And I want to make sure you understand this. This is not the work of human evangelists. And the message is not the gospel of grace. The text is clear. An angel is the evangelist, and the message is in verse 7. Now, in verse 7, the gospel being preached is this: fear God and give Him glory, because the hour of His judgment is come, and worship Him who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and the springs of waters. That's the message that's passed at that time by an angel. Ministries who use this verse to justify their ministries during the church age are misusing this text. The battle for Jerusalem ends. The beast captures Jerusalem. This is Zechariah 13 verses 8 and 9, as well as Zechariah 14:2. The power of the holy people is shattered. Daniel 12:7. Now, just because the beast was able to kill God's 2 witnesses in the middle of the 7 years, that does not mean that he is in full control of Israel or even of Jerusalem. And the power of the holy people can only be broken when God allows it. The devil, the false prophet, and the beast are running rampant on the earth. God is still in control of everything all the time. Let's look at the conquerors first. The beast. Daniel is clear that the beast goes to war with Israel during the second half of the 7 years. He wages war against them. He wears them down. He overpowers them. And he shatters their power. The devil. The devil himself, having been cast out of heaven, went to war with Israel and all believers. That's in Revelation 12, verses 13 and 17. This moment, this final conquering of Jerusalem, is the culmination of that war and of everything that he's done. So let's look at the results. First, in the temple. It is this victory that gives the beast the ability to enter the temple and stand his idol image, his talking statue, the abomination of desolation, in the holy place. This is Jesus' words in Matthew 24:15. Now, Paul includes in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 3 and 4, that the beast himself takes a chair into the holy place and sits down. And these are the 2 initiating events for the Great Tribulation. What are the results of this battle over the people? The results of this battle are that 2/3 of all Israelites will be killed. Of the survivors in Jerusalem, 1/2 will be exiled. That's in Zechariah 13 verses 8 through 9 and Zechariah 14:2. It is very likely that these exiles are the ones that God calls out of Babylon the Great just before the vial judgments are poured out in Revelation 18:4. Let's look at a historical comparison. The times of the Gentiles, back 591 BC. It began with a Babylonian invasion and the appointment of a vassal Zedekiah. The times of the Gentiles will end with a Babylonian invasion and the ascension of the beast. But the day that the beast enters the temple is the day that his authority ends, and the day that the 7th trumpet is blown and that Jesus' authority begins. Israel, at that moment, will again have an Israelite king in the line of David. I want to thank you for tuning into this video. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you haven't seen the previous videos, you need to be sure and go back and watch all of them in order, especially the first 2, because the first 2 are the background and introductory information, and it provides the foundation for how I then fill in the remainder of the events. Again, thank you, and be blessed.